At 1:16 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Staff Sergeant Thomas Whitaker sat in the radio compartment of C-47 number 42-92847, 30 miles from the Normandy coast. German flak batteries had just opened fire. The pilot's voice crackled through his headset. They were 3 minutes from the drop zone. 127 paratroopers sat in the cargo bay behind him, packed tight, waiting to jump. Whitaker's job was simple: monitor the pathfinder signal, confirm the coordinates, and tell the pilot when they reached Zone A. He'd done it 17 times in training, never missed once. The cockpit was freezing. Whitaker's breath fogged in the thin air at 800 feet. His fingers were numb inside his gloves. The radio console flickered. Green light, yellow light, red light. Each one meant something different. He had memorized the sequence 2 months earlier at an airfield in England. Green meant the pathfinder beacon was active. Yellow meant they were approaching the drop zone. Red meant jump. Tonight, the lights made no sense. Whitaker stared at the console. The green light blinked twice, then stopped. Then 3 times, then nothing. His training manual said the beacon should pulse steady, 1 pulse per second. This wasn't steady, this was chaos. He checked the frequency dial. 38.7 megahertz, correct. He checked the antenna connector. He tapped the console. The green light blinked 4 times, paused, then went dark. Behind him, the cargo door was open. Wind howled through the fuselage. The paratroopers sat in 2 rows, hooked to the static line, faces painted black, weapons strapped to their legs. They couldn't hear the radio. They couldn't see lights. They only knew what Whitaker told the pilot. And right now, Whitaker had no idea what to tell him. The pilot's voice came again. Radio, confirm pathfinder signal. Over. Whitaker hesitated. His mouth was dry. He tasted metal. His manual said if the beacon malfunctioned, he must report it immediately. Abort the drop. Circle back. Wait for orders. But there were no orders. And there was no time. The entire invasion depended on the first wave hitting the drop zones on schedule. If they circled back, they would collide with the second wave. 200 planes in the dark. No lights, no room for error. Flak was getting closer. Orange burst lit the sky to the south. Whitaker could see tracer fire arcing up from the coast. The Germans knew they were coming. Every second they stayed on course brought them close. The guns. He looked at the console again. The yellow light flickered, then the red light, then both went dark. According to training, this meant the beacon was offline. You were flying blind. The pilot's voice returned, sharper now. Radio, I need confirmation. Are we on course? Whitaker's hand trembled over the transmit button. He had 2 choices. Tell the truth. Beacon dead. Abort the drop. Relay. Tell the pilot they were on course. Trust his gut. Trust the lights. He could understand. He pressed the button. Pilot, pathfinder signals. Then he noticed something. Beneath the frequency dial was a second dial he had never seen before. A backup selector. It was set to 38.7, but next to it in tiny letters it said, Hey LT 42.1, Whitaker blinked. Training had never mentioned an alternate frequency, but the lights were dead on 38.7. He had nothing to lose. He twisted the dial to 42.1. The green light instantly blazed steady, 1 pulse per second. Perfect. The yellow. Come on, they were 2 miles from the drop zone. Whitaker grabbed the transmit button. Pilot, confirm pathfinder signal. Green and steady. We're on course. The pilot replied immediately. Copy that. 2 minutes to drop. Whitaker exhaled. His hand stopped shaking. He had found the backup frequency, saved the drop, but there was something he didn't know. The frequency he had switched to wasn't the beacon for drop zone A. It was the beacon for drop zone C, 6 miles south. Deep enemy territory. Directly inside the operational zone of the German 91st Infantry Division, and he had just told the pilot to keep flying toward it. To understand how dangerous that mistake was, you need to understand how the Allies planned to drop 15,000 paratroopers into Normandy in total darkness. The plan depended on the pathfinders, small teams of elite paratroopers who jumped 30 minutes before the main force. Their job was simple. Land first, set up radio beacons, mark the drop zones with lights, guide the incoming C-47 aircraft to the correct coordinates. Each drop zone used its own radio frequency. Drop Zone A used 38.7 MHz, Drop Zone B used 40.2, Drop Zone C used 42.1. Radio operators followed the signal and dropped their paratroopers directly on the beacon. In training, the system worked perfectly. Every rehearsal drop in England landed within 200 yards of the target. Commanders called it the most precise airborne operation in history. But Normandy was not England. The first problem was weather. On June 5th, a violent storm rolled across the English Channel. Winds hit 35 miles per hour. Cloud cover dropped to 400 feet. General Eisenhower almost canceled the invasion, but meteorologists predicted a 6-hour window of clear weather after midnight, just enough time. The invasion went ahead. The second problem was German flak. Allied intelligence believed there were 42 anti-aircraft batteries along the Normandy coast. They were wrong. There were 87. When the C-47s crossed the coastline at 1 in the morning, the sky exploded. Tracer fire filled the darkness. Shells detonated around the aircraft. Pilots broke formation to avoid being hit. They climbed, they dove, they scattered. Within minutes, the carefully planned formations dissolved across 50 square miles of countryside. The third problem was the pathfinders themselves. Of 18 pathfinder teams that jumped before midnight, landed near their intended drop zones. The rest were blown off course. Some drowned in flooded fields. Some landed among German units and were killed before activating their beacons. Some landed miles away from their targets. By the time Whitaker's aircraft approached Normandy, the entire navigation system was already collapsing. Signals were weak. Signals overlapped. Some planes found nothing at all. Radio operators had to make impossible decisions. Follow a weak signal. Drop blind or most dropped blind. The results were chaos. Paratroopers landed in rivers and trees in German positions. Units scattered across miles of farmland and hedgerows. Whitaker watched the yellow light pulse steadily on his console. He felt relief. The signal was strong. The backup worked. In 90 seconds, the paratroopers would jump. He believed they were heading for Drop Zone A. But the beacon guiding them belonged to a lone pathfinder from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. His team had landed half a mile off target inside a forest surrounded by German troops.
He activated his beacon anyway.
That was the signal Whitaker followed. The red light flashed. 30 seconds to the drop. Behind Whitaker, the jump master stood in the open doorway. The paratroopers rose to their feet, hooked to the static light. Whitaker pressed the transmit button. Pilot, we're over the drop zone. Seconds later, 127 American paratroopers jumped into the wrong drop zone. The first man out of the air was Sergeant Daniel Hayes. The wind slammed into him like a wall as he stepped into the darkness. For half a second, he felt nothing beneath his boots, just empty air and the roar of the engines above. Then the static line snapped tight. His parachute deployed with a violent jerk that nearly ripped the rifle from his chest harness. The C-47 vanished into the darkness above him, leaving only the distant rumble of engines fading into the night. Hayes looked down. He expected to see the Pathfinder lights of Drop Zone A. Instead, he saw almost nothing. Just scattered hedgerows, dark fields, and a patch of forest directly below him. The wind pushed him sideways hard. 30-mile-per-hour gusts dragged him across the sky like a rag doll. Around him, dozens of other parachutes opened in silence. White canopies drifting across the dark countryside, but something was wrong. The formation was completely scattered. Paratroopers were drifting in every direction. Some were already disappearing behind the tree line. Others were being blown far beyond the fields. Hayes tightened his grip on the control risers and tried to steer away from the forest. But the wind was stronger. The trees rushed toward him. Branches tore through the canopy as he crashed into the upper limbs of a tall oak. The parachute tangled instantly. Hayes swung violently, suspended 30 feet above the ground. For a moment, he hung there in complete silence. Then the shooting started. Rifle fire somewhere in the darkness. Machine guns rattled in short bursts. German voices shouted in the distance. Hayes froze. He was dangling in a tree in enemy territory. His training told him to cut the harness and drop immediately, but from 30 feet up, that could break his legs. He pulled the knife from his boot, carefully sawed through one of the parachute straps. The canopy shifted, branches creaked. He cut the second strap and dropped. He hit the ground hard, but rolled with the impact like he'd practiced in training. For a few seconds, he lay still, listening. The forest smelled of wet earth and smoke. Somewhere nearby, another paratrooper shouted in pain. A burst of machine gun fire answered him. Hayes crawled to the base of a hedgerow and checked his gear. Rifle intact, 2 grenades, 3 magazines, and a small compass strapped to his wrist. He clicked on the tiny red flashlight mounted to his chest and checked the map. Then his stomach dropped according to the map drop. Zone A should have been a wide open field surrounded by farmland, but Hayes was in dense woodland. That meant one thing: they had been dropped in the wrong place, miles off course. Across Normandy, the same realization was spreading among hundreds of scattered paratroopers. Entire companies had been separated. Officers couldn't find their men, men couldn't find their officers. Radio equipment was lost during the jumps. Some units landed in flooded marshes and drowned under the weight of their gear. Others landed directly in German defensive positions, but the chaos had an unexpected side effect. German commanders had no idea what was happening. Reports flooded into headquarters across Normandy. Paratroopers landing near Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers attacking bridges near Canton, paratroopers spotted near Utah Beach. And now, paratroopers appearing deep in the forest near the 91st Infantry Division. To the Germans, it looked like an invasion happening everywhere at once. No one knew where the real attack was. Back in the forest, Sergeant Hayes moved carefully along the hedgerow. Every step felt loud in the silent night. He had no idea where the rest of his unit was, but he knew his mission: find the road leading to Canton, destroy German supply routes, delay reinforcements heading toward the ditches. He had memorized the objective months earlier in England. If he could find the road, he could still complete the mission even alone. Suddenly, he heard footsteps ahead. Hayes dropped flat against the ground. 2 figures moved through the darkness along the opposite hedgerow. German soldiers. They carried rifles and spoke quietly to each other. Probably a patrol searching for parachutists. Hayes waited until they were only 15 feet away. Then he raised his rifle. One shot. The first German fell instantly. The second soldier spun around in shock. Hayes fired again. Silence returned to the forest. Hayes grabbed their equipment quickly. One of them carried a map case. Inside was something even more valuable: a detailed road map of the entire region. Hayes studied it under the faint red light, and that's when he saw the truth. The forest he landed in wasn't near Drop Zone A at all. It was 6 miles south, directly beside a critical German supply road connecting the coastal defenses to the inland reserves. If German reinforcements used that road at dawn, they could reach Utah Beach within hours. Hayes stared at the map, then he smiled. Maybe the drop wasn't a mistake after all. Maybe it was an opportunity. Across Normandy, dozens of small groups of paratroopers were making the same discovery. They were lost, but they were also everywhere. Instead of one organized landing zone, thousands of soldiers were scattered across the countryside, blocking roads, ambushing patrols, destroying communication lines. German commanders couldn't respond to all of them, and that confusion bought the Allied invasion precious time. Back in the forest, Hay moved toward the road shown on the German map. He found it within 15 minutes, a narrow dirt road running between hedgerows. Tire tracks covered the mud. Supply trucks had used it recently. Hayes studied the area. A perfect ambush point sat 50 yards down the road where the hedgerows narrowed. He pulled one of his grenades from his belt, carefully removed the pin halfway so it could be thrown instantly. Waited. Dawn was still an hour away, but the sound of engines soon echoed through the distance. A German convoy approached. 3 trucks loaded with infantry. Hayes stayed perfectly still. The first truck rolled into the ambush point. 10 yards, 8 yards, 6 yards. Hayes stood and hurled the grenade. The explosion ripped through the front truck, sending soldiers flying into the ditch. Hayes fired into the survivors with controlled bursts. The second truck slammed on its brakes. German soldiers jumped out in panic, but they had no idea where the attack came. Hayes fired again from the hedgerow. 2 more Germans fell. The rest fled into the darkness. Within seconds, the road was silent again. Hayes checked the wreckage quickly. The trucks were destroyed, the road blocked. Any reinforcements trying to use this route would be delayed for hours. And Hayes had done it completely alone. Across Normandy, hundreds of similar fights were happening at the same time. Small groups of paratroopers, sometimes just 2 or 3 men, destroying bridges and convoys, cutting telephone lines. The invasion plan had collapsed, but the chaos itself became the Allies' greatest advantage. And none of it would have happened if a nervous radio operator hadn't turned the wrong frequency dial in the back of a C-47. Back over the English Channel, Staff Sergeant Thomas Whitaker still believed he had saved the mission. He sat at his radio console listening to the steady pulse of the beacon guiding them home. He had no idea that the signal he followed had dropped 127 paratroopers into one of the most dangerous areas in Normandy. But within a few hours, those scattered soldiers would accomplish something no carefully planned operation ever could. They would paralyze an entire German division, and the invasion of Normandy would succeed partly because of a mistake. By the time the first gray light of dawn appeared over Normandy, the countryside had turned into a maze of confusion. German officers were receiving reports from every direction. Paratroopers near Sainte-Mère-Église. Paratroopers destroying bridges south of Carrington. Paratroopers attacking patrols deep in, and none of it made sense. According to German intelligence, airborne troops were supposed to land in large, organized groups, but what they were seeing looked completely different. Small clusters of soldiers, 2 or 5 there, sometimes just a single man moving through the hedgerows. To German commanders, it looked less like a coordinated attack and more like an invasion happening everywhere at once. And that uncertainty was exactly what the Allies needed. The hedgerow problem, Normandy's countryside, was unlike anything most American soldiers had seen before. Fields were separated by thick hedgerows, massive walls of earth and tangled bushes, sometimes 8 feet high. These natural barriers created narrow corridors between fields, perfect defensive positions, perfect ambush points, but also perfect hiding places. For scattered paratroopers, the hedgerows became their greatest ally. They could move unseen, attack suddenly, then disappear into another field before German troops knew what happened. Sergeant Daniel Hayes discovered this quickly. After destroying the convoy on the road, he moved deeper into the hedgerow maze. The early morning fog helped him stay hidden. German patrols were already searching the area, but they were nervous. They expected organized enemy units, not one man appearing out of nowhere. Hayes followed the hedgerow line north. Eventually, he spotted movement ahead. 3 American paratroopers crouched behind a stone wall. They raised their rifles instantly when they saw him. Then one of them whispered password. Hayes answered immediately. Flash. The soldier nodded. They lowered their weapons. The 4 men looked at each other with relief. Finally, friendly faces. The small group introduced themselves quickly. Private Collins, Corporal Diaz, Lieutenant Mark Reynolds. Reynolds was the highest ranking officer among them, and technically that made him the commander of this tiny improvised unit. He spread a map across the dirt. You guys land near drop zone. Everyone shook their heads. Same here, Reynolds said. I think we're way south. Hayes showed them the German road map he captured earlier. Reynolds studied it carefully, then his eyes widened. This road leads straight to the coastal highway. The coastal highway was critical. If German reinforcements used it, they could reach Utah Beach within hours and attack the landing forces. Reynolds pointed at a narrow bridge marked on the map. If we destroy this bridge, the Germans can't move armor north. Collins frowned. We're 4 guys with rifles. Reynolds smiled slightly. That's 4 more than the Germans expect. German headquarters, meanwhile, inside a command post near Carrington, Colonel Friedrich von Stein studied the incoming reports. Maps covered the walls. Red pins marked enemy sightings. Everywhere. Paratroopers had been reported across a 30-mile area. His staff officers argued around him. Sir, they're attempting sabotage operations. No, this must be the main invasion force. That's impossible. The beaches are quiet. Von Stein slammed his fist on the table. Silence. He stared at the map. Something about this situation felt wrong. These paratroopers weren't forming units. They weren't capturing towns. They were simply appearing, attacking small targets, disappearing again. But the effect was devastating. Telephone lines were cut, supply trucks destroyed, patrols ambushed. Communication between German units was breaking down. Von Stein finally gave the only order he could. Deploy patrols everywhere. It sounded reasonable, but it was exactly the wrong move. Instead of concentrating their forces, the Germans began scattering their own soldiers across the countryside. And that played perfectly into the hands of the scattered American paratroopers. Back in the hedgerows, Lieutenant Reynolds led the four-man group toward the bridge marked on the map. The fog had started to lift. Sunlight filtered across the fields. In the distance, they could hear artillery from the beaches. The invasion had begun, but here inland, the battle was quiet, almost too quiet. The bridge appeared around a bend in the road, a small stone structure crossing a narrow canal. Two German soldiers stood guard beside. A motorcycle leaned against the railing. Reynolds studied the position. The guards looked right. He clearly didn't expect trouble. Hayes, Reynolds whispered. You still have that grenade? Hayes nodded. Reynolds pointed toward a shallow ditch beside the road. Get close. Toss it behind them. Hayes crawled forward through the grass. 10 yards, 8 yards. The guards were laughing about something. One of them lit a cigarette. Hayes pulled the grenade and counted 1 second, then threw it. The explosion shattered the warning. Both guards were thrown off their feet. Before they could recover, Reynolds and the others opened fire. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds, then silence returned. The bridge was theirs, but destroying it would be harder. None of them carried explosives. Reynolds stared at the motorcycle. Then an idea formed. Drain the fuel, he ordered. They quickly emptied gasoline from the tank and poured it across the wooden support beams beneath the bridge. Then they tossed a flare into the fuel. Flames spread instantly. Smoke rose into the morning sky. The fire burned through the wooden supports within minutes. With a loud crack, the center of the bridge collapsed into the canal. The road was now completely blocked. German vehicles would have to take a much longer route north. Hours lost. Hours that would save countless Allied soldiers landing on the beaches. Whitaker's discovery back on the transport aircraft returning to England, Staff Sergeant Whitaker finally removed his headset. The mission was over, but something still bothered him. He reviewed the navigation logs again. The alternate frequency, 42.1 megahertz. Something about it felt wrong. He pulled out the mission briefing folder, flipped through the drop zone hertz, then he found it. Drop zone A, 38.7 megahertz. Drop zone B, 40.2 MHz, drop zone C, 42.1 MHz. Whitaker stared at the page. His stomach turned cold. He had guided the aircraft to the wrong drop zone. 6 miles south of the intended target, 127. Paratroopers dropped into enemy territory of his mistake. He closed the folder slowly. For the rest of the flight, he said nothing. The unexpected result, by midday, the full scale of the airborne chaos became clear. Instead of landing in neat formations, more than half the paratroopers had scattered across Normandy. At first, Allied commanders feared the operation had failed. Units were missing, equipment lost, objectives incomplete. But then reports started arriving. German destroyed, bridges roads blocked, telephone lines cut, small groups of paratroopers attacking everywhere instead of one concentrated drop zone. The Germans now faced hundreds of small enemy forces across the countryside. They couldn't respond to all of them. Their defenses stretched in. And that confusion prevented German reinforcements from reaching the beaches quickly. The invasion had gained precious time that would decide the outcome of D-Day, and far from the beaches, scattered paratroopers had just destroyed a bridge that no one had originally planned to attack, all because they landed in the wrong place, because a radio operator had turned the wrong dial, because the chaos of war turned a mistake into an advantage. By early afternoon on June 6th, the situation across Normandy had become almost impossible for the German command to understand. Reports were arriving faster than officers could read them. Paratroopers had been seen near Sainte-Mère-Église. Others were reported attacking supply convoys near Carrington. Some had been spotted destroying telephone lines miles inland. None of it followed the pattern of a normal airborne assault. Normally, paratroopers landed in large formations, secured a specific objective, and waited for reinforcements. But this time the battlefield looked completely different. Small groups of soldiers were appearing everywhere, sometimes 2 men, sometimes 10, sometimes just 1. And each group seemed to be something different. Roads, bridges, communication centers, patrols, supply trucks. To the German command, it felt as if thousands of invisible enemies were moving through the hedgerows, but in reality, those units were simply scattered survivors trying to find each other. The mistake that dropped them in the wrong place had shattered the original plan, yet somehow the chaos was turning into an advantage. A growing resistance, Lieutenant Mark Reynolds and his 3 paratroopers had just destroyed the small bridge over the canal. Smoke still rose from the wreckage. The road was now completely unusable. Reynolds knew the Germans would investigate quickly. They couldn't stay there long. Move, he said quietly. The group slipped back into the hedgerows. They had been together less than 2 hours. Yet already they had destroyed a convoy and collapsed a bridge. But Reynolds knew something important. They still hadn't completed their main objective, the road north. If German armored units that highway, they could reach Utah Beach and attack the American landing forces. Reynolds studied the German map again while crouching behind a hedge. The coastal highway lay about 2 miles north. Between them and the road sat a small village. and villages usually meant German troops. Still, they had no choice. They began moving again. The village patrolled the village appeared slowly through the hedgerows. A handful of stone houses, a small church, a crossroads in the center. Reynolds raised hand, stopping the group. Through binoculars, he spotted movement near the church. German soldiers, at least 8 of them. They were setting up a temporary checkpoint, probably trying to control movement after hearing the explosion from the bridge. Reynolds lowered the binoculars. 4 paratroopers against 8 soldiers wasn't good odds. But the road they needed ran directly through the village. Going around would take hours, and time was something the invasion couldn't afford. Reynolds thought for a moment, then he turned to Hayes. "Remember that grenade trick?" Hayes smiled slightly. "I've got one left." Reynolds nodded. "We create confusion, hit them fast, then disappear." The plan took less than a minute to explain, and 5 minutes later it was already happening. Hayes crawled along a hedgerow until he reached the edge of the village road. The German soldiers were still talking beside their truck. One of them was smoking. Another leaned against the hood with his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. They had no idea Americans were only yards away. Hayes pulled the grenade and waited 1 second, then tossed it toward the truck. The explosion shattered the calm afternoon. German soldiers dove for cover. At that exact moment, Reynolds and the others opened fire from 2 different hedgerows. The sudden attack created total confusion. The Germans couldn't tell how many attackers they were facing. Some fired wildly toward the fields. Others tried to drag soldiers behind the truck. Within seconds, 2 Germans were down. Another ran toward the church. Reynolds shouted, "Fall back." The paratroopers disappeared into the hedgerows just as quickly as they had appeared. They didn't stay to finish the fight. They didn't need to. The checkpoint was destroyed, and the road was now clear. German command under pressure inside Colonel von Stein's headquarters. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The map on the wall now looked like a battlefield of red pins. Each one marked another attack, another ambush, another destroyed vehicle. Officers tried to organize patrols, but every patrol seemed to run into paratroopers somewhere along the road. Supply trucks were delayed, messages couldn't get through. Even worse, rumors began spreading among the German soldiers. Some believed thousands of paratroopers had already landed. Others believed they were surrounded. The truth was much simpler. The Americans weren't everywhere, they were just everywhere. But the psychological effect was the same. And that confusion slowed the German response at the exact moment the Allied forces were landing on the beaches. The coastal highway. Late in the afternoon, Reynolds and his small group finally reached the edge of the coastal highway. This road was much larger than the others, wide enough for armored vehicles. Fresh tire tracks covered the surface. German convoys had been moving through here recently. Reynolds studied the area carefully. The road curved around a small hill, a perfect choke point. If they blocked it, any vehicles approaching from the south would be forced to stop. But once again, they faced the same problem. No explosives, no heavy weapons, just rifles and one last grenade. Reynolds looked around, then he noticed something useful. A supply truck sat parked beside a farmhouse near the road, probably abandoned during the earlier chaos. The truck was loaded with wooden crates. Reynolds opened one. Inside were more shells. His eyes lit up. "Now we're talking," he said. They quickly stacked several crates across the road. Then Hayes carefully placed a grenade inside one of the boxes. The plan was simple. When the first German vehicle hit the barricade, the grenade would ignite the shells. The explosion would destroy the road completely. The trap was ready. Now they just had to wait. Whitaker's burden back in England. Staff Sergeant Whitaker stepped off the transport plane with heavy steps. The mission technically succeeded. The aircraft returned safely. But he couldn't stop thinking about the frequency dial. 42.1 megahertz, the wrong beacon. He imagined the paratroopers landing in the darkness, scattered alone, possibly surrounded by German troops, and it was his fault. He reported to the operations tent and handed over the navigation log. The officer glanced through it quickly. "Looks good," he said. Whitaker hesitated. "Sir, I may have guided the aircraft to the wrong drop zone." Officer looked up sharply. "Wow." Whitaker explained the alternate frequency, the beacon signal, the realization during the flight home. The officer listened silently. Then he folded the report. "Right now, the entire airborne operation is chaos," he said. "Units are scattered." Whitaker's heart sank, so it really had gone wrong. But the officer continued, and strangely enough, that chaos might actually be helping us. Whitaker frowned. Across Normandy, roads blocked, patrols ambushed. The officer looked directly at him. "Your paratroopers might be part of that." Whitaker didn't answer. But for the first time since the flight home, he felt a small flicker of hope. Waiting for the convoy back on the coastal highway, Reynolds and his men waited behind the hedgerow. The sun was beginning to drop toward the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the road. Then they heard it. Engines, heavy ones, an armored convoy approaching from the south. Reynolds tightened his grip on his rifle. If the trap worked, the road would be destroyed. If it failed, 4 paratroopers would face armored vehicles with nothing but rifles. The first German truck appeared around the curve, then another, and behind them a half-track loaded with soldiers. The lead vehicle slowed when it saw the crates blocking the road. The driver leaned out the window, shouting something to the soldiers behind him. Then the truck rolled forward. The front time, touched the barricade. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the grenade detonated. The explosion ignited the mortar shells instantly. A massive blast ripped through the road. Fire and debris shot into the sky. The lead truck flipped sideways. The half-track slammed into the wreckage behind it. Smoke filled the air. The road was completely destroyed. Reynolds watched the chaos unfold from the hedgerow. German soldiers scrambled for cover. Some fired randomly into the fields, but the Americans were already gone, just 4 paratroopers vanishing back into the hedgerows, leaving behind a destroyed convoy and a shattered highway. Another road closed, another delay for German reinforcements, and another example of how a simple mistake had turned into one of the most effective sabotage operations of the entire invasion. The explosion on the coastal highway could be heard for miles. Smoke rose high above the hedgerows, a dark column twisting into the evening sky. Lieutenant Reynolds and his paratroopers didn't stop to watch it. They were already moving. Experience had taught them one thing during the last 12 hours. Never stay in one place. The hedgerows swallowed them again as they moved north across another field. Behind them, the German convoy burned. The road was completely destroyed. And with it, another possible route for reinforcements heading toward the beaches. But the battle across Normandy was far from over. Chaos across the battlefield by the evening of June. Thousands of American paratroopers were scattered across the French countryside. Some had gathered into small units. Others were still completely alone, but almost all of them were doing the same thing: sabotage, ambush, delay. Small groups were attacking telephone lines connecting German headquarters. Others were destroying bridges over canals and rivers. Some were simply firing at German patrols to force them into defensive positions. None of these actions had been planned exactly this way, but together they created something powerful. Confusion. German commanders had expected one organized airborne assault. Instead, they faced hundreds of small attacks happening everywhere at once. They couldn't tell which ones were important. They couldn't concentrate their forces. And every hour of delay helped the Allied troops landing on the beaches. German command breaks down inside Colonel von Stein's headquarters. The situation had become almost impossible to control. Reports covered desk, destroyed convoys, missing patrols, bridges collapsed, telephone lines cut. Even the coastal highway had just been reported destroyed by an explosion. Von Stein stared at the map in frustration. Red pins covered the entire region, but there was no clear front line, no single target to attack. Everywhere he sent troops, they encountered more paratroopers. The Americans were ghosts, appearing suddenly, attacking, then disappearing into the hedgerows again. And while German forces struggled to regain control inland, the most important battle was happening along the coast. Thousands of Allied soldiers were landing on the beaches, and German reinforcements were arriving too slowly to stop them. Reynolds' final mission as darkness approached again. Lieutenant Reynolds finally stopped his small group near an abandoned farmhouse. They had been moving almost constantly since the morning. Everyone was exhausted. Hayes leaned against the stone wall and took a long breath. "We've been fighting for almost 20 hours. Reynolds nodded. "And we're still alive." Collins laughed quietly. "That's a good sign." For the first time all day, the 4 men allowed themselves a short rest. But Reynolds still had one last task. He unfolded the German map again. Their original objective, reaching friendly forces near Utah Beach, was still several miles away. But now something had changed. In the distance, they could hear the steady rumble of artillery from the coast. That meant the beach was holding. Allied forces had successfully landed. The invasion was working. Reynolds looked at his men. "We move at first light," he said. "If we're lucky, we'll link up with our units tomorrow." No one argued. After everything they had done during the day, simply surviving the night felt like a victory. Whitaker learns the truth 2 days later. Back in England, Staff Sergeant Thomas Whitaker finally received the first reports from Normandy. He stood inside the operations tent listening as officers discussed the airborne landings. Units had been scattered far beyond their planned drop zones. Some paratroopers landed miles away from their objectives. At first it sounded like a disaster, but then the reports continued. German supply routes destroyed, convoys ambushed, bridges collapsed. Entire divisions delayed while searching for small groups of paratroopers. One officer even mentioned the destruction of the coastal highway by an unknown airborne unit. Whitaker felt his chest tighten. He remembered the alternate frequency, the wrong beacon, the aircraft he had guided 6 miles south. Those paratroopers had landed in exactly that region. One of the officers noticed him standing nearby. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Whitaker hesitated before speaking. "I might have helped drop some of those paratroopers in the wrong place." The officer studied him for a moment, then he smiled. "Well," he said, tapping the map, "wherever you dropped them, they did a hell of a job." Whitaker didn't know what to say. For 2 days he had believed he made a terrible mistake, but now it seemed that mistake might have helped the invasion succeed. The real outcome: by the end of June 6th, Allied forces had established a strong foothold in Normandy. Utah Beach had been secured, and many historians later agreed on something remarkable. The scattered airborne landings, once feared to be a disaster, had actually played a critical role in the success of D-Day because the paratroopers landed everywhere. German commanders never knew where the main threat was. They spread their forces too thin, and that confusion gave the beach landings enough time to succeed. Thousands of small, improvised actions by isolated soldiers changed the course of the battle. Actions that were never part of the original plan, actions that happened only because the operation had gone wrong. A different kind of victory weeks later, after the Normandy campaign had pushed deeper into France. Sergeant Daniel Hayes finally rejoined his original unit. Most of the men from his aircraft had survived, but nearly all of them had landed in different places. Each had their own story: ambushes, sabotage, days spent hiding in hedgerows. No two experiences were the same, and none of it had happened exactly the way planners expected, but together their actions had helped slow the German response during the most important hours of the invasion. Years later, historians would look back on D-Day and study every detail of the operation: the naval bombardments, the beach landings, the airborne assaults. And among those details, they would discover dozens of small stories. Stories of soldiers who landed in the wrong place, made unexpected decisions, and changed the outcome of the battle. Sometimes the most important moments in history don't come from perfect plans. Sometimes they come from mistakes, from confusion, from soldiers forced to improvise in the middle of chaos. And on the night of June 6, 1944, one radio operator turning the wrong frequency dial helped scatter paratroopers across Normandy. What looked like an error became one of the most unexpected advantages of the entire invasion. A reminder that in war and in history, success doesn't always come from everything going right. Sometimes it comes from surviving when everything goes